So we'll continue moving forward. Let's talk about standard costing versus just regular costing. So what is standard costing? So standing costs are present costs for delivering products. They're what we establish for personal, engineering, accounting, etc. And our accounting will figure out this costing based on historical experiences or past experiences. We use expected levels of performance, and we use this to determine direct labor, direct materials, and overhead. And so we use standard costing in the flexible budget system so we can better understand our variances. And so when we're talking standard costs, the standard costs are how we determine the cost per unit, where we went up here, right? This variable amount per unit, this would be the standard cost that we'd be using for our budgeting. And then we'd revise it continuously. And so this $1 is the standard cost for the direct materials, right? During the period, that might go up, it might go down, but we benchmark it against this $1 and we determine that as what's reasonable in our previous periods. So, right, here's setting standard costs. We'd want to look at both price standards and quantity standards. So here, take notes here, right? And I want you to memorize each one of these pieces: direct materials, direct labor, variable overhead. You should know those buckets, but each one of those has two predominant areas where you can have some kind of variance. And we mentioned that previously when we were, and briefly when we were talking about budgeting, right? Direct materials, what can go wrong with direct materials? If I'm making a cake, right? It was my wife's birthday yesterday, so I'm thinking cakes. I ate too much cake. If I'm making the cake, I can say every cake requires 3 eggs, a pound of sugar, a pound of butter, and a pound of flour, let's say. And I could say each of those ingredients should cost a fixed amount. So each cake, let's say the fixed ingredients cost $2, and we have to use that amount of ingredients. But that's the $2 is a price standard, and the amount of ingredients is a quantity standard. But while we're making the cake, we can mess up the quantity. We can use too much or too little. If we use too little, we might mess up the quality. If we use too much, we might incur too many expenses. Or we can lose product. Like we can break some eggs. We can accidentally have ants in our sugar, so our quantity standards could be affected. Or our price, we could spend too much for the sugar, too much for the eggs. I want us to think through labor. Same thing with labor. We just talked about that. The rate could be too high or too low for our labor, or our labor could be doing the work in too slow or too quick or very quickly. So each one of these will result in favorable or unfavorable variances. Variable overhead, we have our rate standards and our activity standards. I think of this as electricity, right? If I'm paying $100 a month in electricity on average for using, I don't know kilowatts well, but using an average house of electricity, I could either use too much electricity, which drives the activity up, or the rate could go up for the amount of electricity I'm using, which will drive up my variable overhead. So we need to split them out and decide into these different buckets, memorize it: direct materials, pricing standards, quantity; direct labor, rate and time; and variable, rate and activity. And so if we think about this, each one of these buckets has a quantity component, right? Amount used, amount of time used, or the amount of activity, quantity component, and a price component. How much we spent for the materials, how much we pay for the employees, and how much we pay for the electricity or overhead. So that's the thought here, right? We break out each of them into identifiable components because each one can be managed differently. I can manage the amount of electricity I use, or I can manage and negotiate the rates I'm using it at.